I love the great despisers. Man is something that has to be surpassed. Nietzsche, chapter 1. It was considered a good omen that the church bells were ringing on October 15, 1844, when Friedrich Nietzsche was born in Rocken, the son of a Lutheran minister and grandson of two clergymen. Prussia was celebrating the king's birthday, and when Father Nietzsche baptized his son, he christened him with the king's own name, Friedrich Wilhelm. On that occasion, the happy father gave a brief speech praising himself for the privilege of being able to baptize his own child and recalling that for a number of years, the month of October had always been a season of good luck for him. His heart was full of gratitude, but the speech, as quoted by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, forgot entirely to mention Nietzsche's mother, who was later to witness the agony of Friedrich's mental breakdown and to survive the unhappy philosopher. His father died when Friedrich Nietzsche was not yet 5 years old, and the family moved to Naumburg, where young Nietzsche grew up in a household consisting of his mother, sister, grandmother, and two maiden aunts. There is evidence that the child was a model of behavior and highly talented pupil, whom his playmates called, quote-unquote, the little pastor, because of his precocious dignity. At 10, he wrote several plays and composed music. Elizabeth claimed the credit for having preserved many proofs of his creative genius, which are now part of the Nietzsche archives she founded at Weimar. His fellow students respected him as much as his teachers. The young Nietzsche showed early a gift for self-analysis, a gift that was to make him later the author of the autobiographer Ecce Homo, and wrote his first autobiography at 14. There had always been an apocryphal tradition in the family that the Nietzsches were descendants of Polish aristocracy, and young Friedrich used to sign his name as Nicky, or Friedrich W. V. Nietzsche. When the boy once had composed several mazurkas, he dedicated the small collection to the quote-unquote memory of our ancestors. Reminiscing at the age of 39, the philosopher wrote of himself proudly as a descendant of Polish aristocrats who had suffered because of their Protestant faith. He referred to his appearance as of the quote-unquote Polish type, recording proudly how Italians used to speak of him as quote-unquote Il Polacco, and how Polish travelers had frequently mistaken him for one of their fellow countrymen. In Switzerland, the German philosopher introduced himself as a Swiss to a Pole, but was again flattered by being considered Polish. But even Elizabeth, who has always defended her brother's peculiarities in a fanatical and unreasonable manner, speaks of these Polish ties as a myth based on little or no reliable information. The boy submitted himself willingly to the rigorous discipline and academic training of the famous Forta boarding school, which he entered at 14. Once more, it seemed like an ironic touch of history that the study of religion proved to be one of his best subjects there. Forta demanded of its graduating students a curriculum vitae, a brief autobiographical sketch that has been preserved in Nietzsche's case. He speaks of the years from 9 to 15 as the ones characterized by an urge for quote-unquote universal knowledge, and notes also the doctrinaire zeal with which he used to play and write little quote-unquote books, submitting them to his friends. Naturally, he speaks also about his musical training and comments upon his lack of concentration, a weakness in which Forta caused him to make some change. Although even in 1864, when entering Bonn University, he still felt the need for a more rigid self-discipline. His Forta teachers called his work in religion, Latin, and German essay writing outstanding, commending him also on the mastery of German and Greek literature while criticizing him in several other respects. The graduation certificate speaks of his intention to study classical philology and theology at Bonn University and expresses the hope that he might, quote, achieve in his vocation a level of great efficiency, close quote. Nietzsche soon felt disgusted at the beer drinking and carousing fraternity life at Bonn, and for some time his letters home continued to reflect the sound moral standards of his family. But his fellow student Paul Deussen, later an authority in the field of Sanskrit, published in his memoirs of Friedrich Nietzsche, after the philosopher's death, an episode of Nietzsche's student days that is likely to have been a turning point in Nietzsche's moral and spiritual development. Arriving at Cologne one day, Nietzsche asked a guide to show him to a hotel. This sinister character brought him to a house of prostitution, where the inexperienced and confused young man saw in the sad company of women a piano, the only quote-unquote being in the room that seemed to still have a soul. Rushing towards it, he played a few chords and then hurried outside. Thomas Mann had expressed the suspicion that he may have returned at some later time, and the author of Dr. Faustus used this episode in his novel, making Nietzsche's double, Leverkusen, undergo the same traumatic experience. In 1869, Nietzsche reported at the Basel Students' Clinic that he had contracted syphilis 3 years earlier, and we know that he had twice been infected. It is, of course, especially tempting to attach a psychoanalytical significance to these experiences because his later extreme opinions on women and his unfortunate personal fate as a solitary prophet might well have their roots in such early moral shocks. These theories are all the more plausible as his life was rather uneventful and scarcely supplies the external motivation for his explosive philosophy. But as in the case of Kierkegaard, the philosopher's spiritual evolution cannot possibly be traced back solely to personal experiences. Nietzsche's enthusiasm for the world of Greek and Roman antiquity, his interest in contemporary philosophy, especially in Schopenhauer, his enthusiasm for music and his devotion to Wagner, passing as the friendship of the two proved to be, his passionate interest in every phase of artistic and literary life at Bonn and later in Leipzig, together with the turbulent political events of his time, have undoubtedly been the most strongly determining factors in his spiritual evolution. There were 3 wars in short succession: 1864, 1866, and 1870 to 1871, and Nietzsche saw a short period of service in a medical aid in the Franco-Prussian War. Thomas Mann points towards the core of his being when he characterizes him as a tender and sensitive artist in need of affection and not one made to live in the torturing aloneness that was to become his fate. Such considerations, however, do not necessarily remove the influence of the physical and moral shock of his student days, from which he must have suffered more intensely than modern medical and psychological progress permit us to comprehend. Nietzsche's violent rebellion against the tables of the old and his barbarian display of strength and power can only evoke sympathy for whatever moral pains he experienced. These shocks undoubtedly contributed to his outlook on life. And once he had outgrown the rigid bounds of family tradition and religious training, no inhibition seemed able to control his thinking and to keep it within reason. He became a cyclops, hurling devastation and defiance at Europe society. Nothing was left of his religious background except the extreme contradiction to everything that once had been sacred to him. His most revered teacher at Bonn was Friedrich, whose research in antiquity determined for at least a whole generation the standard of research in this field. And when Rizko transferred his university teaching to Leipzig, Nietzsche followed him there. At Leipzig, Nietzsche's best friend was Erwin Roda, later the famous author of Psyche. But this friendship cooled off when Roda married after having established himself as a scholar and became increasingly critical of Nietzsche's revolutionary zeal. Shortly before the outbreak of Nietzsche's insanity, 1889, Roda said of him, quote, "There was something about him that I had never met before. He was as though he had come from a land where nobody else was living," close quote. Nietzsche's student days came to an abrupt end when he was called to Basel University to teach classical philology even before he had received a doctor's degree. This appointment, a rare distinction for a young man of 24, may well have strengthened his inordinate self-esteem to the excessive degree that has become associated with him. He taught at Basel for 10 years. His persistent illness, partly caused by the strain of his brief service in the Franco-Prussian War, forced his retirement at the age of 35. The story of his physical suffering is again open to a predominantly psychological analysis. His tantalizing attacks of migraines, his ever-occurring stomach ailments, and the long-lasting periods of weakness not only paralyzed his creative strength but also aroused in him the rare effort to resist the whims of his body by spiritual energies. In this will to overpower his illness, he even came to regard health without an inward spiritual substance and nothing but sickness, whereas an undefeated spiritual existence was only possible in resistance to physical obstacles, of which he had more than his share. His retirement afforded at least leisure to his writing, and his most exciting books were the products of this period of enforced academic inactivity. Nietzsche's friendship with Richard Wagner rose to the highest point during his Basel period. He not only revered Wagner as an eminent composer, but also regarded him as a kind of prophetic apparition in a drab age of mediocrity. Wagner was living proof that true genius is independent of time and circumstance. The composer's hostility to the Christian faith and his bold revival of Germanic paganism in his operas made a lasting impression on the young Nietzsche. It is easy to see traces of such influences in Nietzsche's later work, especially in The Antichrist. Wagner held Christianity to be alien to Germanic culture and racial instinct. It had Jewish or Oriental roots. It created nothing but hypocrisy and the negation of the will to power. It would lead to shameful weakness and the ultimate cessation of life. Christianity, so Wagner believed, had, quote, choked off, close quote, the artistic impulse of the German nation. Now, Wotan was to replace Jehovah, and Siegfried would be the Germanic Christ. Wagner's boastful prediction that, quote, my baton will yet become the scepter of the future, close quote, sounded convincing to the music-intoxicated and word-drunk Nietzsche, who also worshipped Wagner's wife Cosima as the modern Greek goddess, speaking of her in his later insane ravings as my wife Cosima Wagner, close quote. The quote-unquote magic of extremes to which Nietzsche was ever so easily surrendering turned him at last against Richard Wagner, whose folk mania, anti-Semitism, and pompous self-deification repelled Nietzsche more and more, so that he even attacked Wagner publicly in his writings. There were good reasons for Nietzsche's side for the unfortunate outcome to this friendship, but the human disillusionment was also one more proof that Nietzsche's inability to maintain ties of lasting friendship. This trait interfered in an even more tragic manner in Nietzsche's friendship with Lou Salomon, a young woman of Russian-Finnish background and a person of unusual intellect, artistic intuition, and personal charm. She seemed destined to fulfill the philosopher's most ardent desire for someone who would not only be an heir to his thoughts, but also develop them beyond their present stage. But again, the friendship came to nothing, although Nietzsche believed for a time that his love for her might find a response. The illusion at one time had even prompted him to propose marriage to her through the mediation of Paul Reye, a common friend of the two, who, however, seems not to have carried out his delicate mission. An abrupt separation followed, and there is reason to believe that Elizabeth Nietzsche, jealous and prejudiced as she proved to be on many other occasions during and after the philosopher's life, had also interfered in this affair. Nietzsche's literary production began with The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, an attempt to interpret Greek art and drama in the light of Schopenhauer's philosophy. His Untimely Meditations, 1873 to 1876, were in part critical and controversial, but the last two, dedicated to Schopenhauer and Wagner, presented appreciative interpretations of the two great minds. The most decisive break with the thinking of the past occurred during his retirement and the ensuing social isolation. Human, All Too Human, 1878 to 1880, The Dawn of Day, 1881, The Gay Science, 1882, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1882 to 1885, Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, Genealogy of Morals, 1887, and The Twilight of Idols, 1889, the posthumously published Antichrist, and his final spiritual self-characterization, Ecce Homo, are part and parcel of his gigantic, quote, revaluations of all values, close quote, marking various stages in this spiritual revolution. His Will to Power, the, quote, history of the next 2 centuries, close quote, published after his death, had not been completed in systematic form. Let me check this real quick. Much to these later writings evolved in ecstatic states of mind and was written with the furious speed that reminds one of Kierkegaard's creative energy. Their unsystematic character is only in part explained by his illness and the high tension characteristic of his work methods. He seemed unable to channel the never-ending flow of new thoughts and fleeting visions into an ordered literary form, a manner he rejected anyway as part of a dying era. His thoughts on the nature of man, religion, politics, music, and art are scattered over many of his writings and only grow into coherent unity when viewed within the total design of his thinking. He was aware of the nature of his presentation, but again and again the alchemy of his brilliant language added its own seductive charm to his nervous tendency, and he surrendered as often to the temptation of playing with words as with ideas. Though he had been an outsider at Basel University during the years of his retirement, he became even more lonely than before. He conceived many of his literary ideas during his excursions in the mountains, his frequent visits to northern Italy, and in endless solitary broodings in his room. The fight against his illness, the true nature of which is likely to remain unknown, caused depressing periods of melancholy, which alternated with manic states of elation and pride. Many a time he expected death to overcome him. He wrote, quote, "It is a crucial fact that the spirit prefers to descend upon the sick and suffering," close quote. His various references to sickness as a quote-unquote great stimulant having the function of hardening him and spurring the creative impulses are quite characteristic of the stoicism which he demanded for facing life's vicissitudes without the aid of Christian religion. Towards the end of the torments of his illness accelerated his mental excess. There were no more restraints in his thinking, and the meteoric fire of his earlier grandiose ideas dissolved into little sparks and ashes. He attacked everything and everybody in unbridled lust for destruction and nihilism, exalting himself to the rank of a deity and world ruler. Quote, "How to Philosophize with a Hammer," close quote. The subtitle of his Will to Power was symbolical of the entire final phase. He had indeed become the quote-unquote dynamite which he had called himself in his autobiographical Ecce Homo, a book containing such phrases as "why I am so intelligent," "why I write such good books," "why I am fate." He spoke of himself as a successor to the dead God, Nietzsche's Caesar, the crucified one, and Dionysius. He decreed the Emperor Wilhelm should be placed before a court and executed. Insanity was clearly overpowering a mind that had formerly been so brilliant. Interesting. Medical opinions about his illness have always been divided, but the syphilitic infection and subsequent paresis are likely to have been among the determining factors in his breakdown. The end came while he was in Turin, the very city where lived Cesare Lombroso, psychiatrist and author of the widely known Genius and Insanity. Nietzsche collapsed in the street and had to be taken to Basel and later to a Jena asylum. The picture of his childhood and youth convey the impression of unusual intelligence and alertness, as do the photographs taken in 1867 and 1882 when he was at the height of his creative period. In contrast to these, Nietzsche's photographs as a sword-bearing private first-class artilleryman taken in 1868 is as grotesque as his repeated boast that his intellectual attacks had the force of artillery fire. Hans Olde, last etching of the sick philosopher taken shortly before his death, still retains some of the distant suggestions of the grandeur which Max Klinger had bestowed upon his idealized marble statue. But it is nevertheless a sad image of decay and derangement. The volcanic glow of the eyes had disappeared, and the anxious letters of his mothers speak of hours and days on end during which the patient, while gazing into empty space, uttered not a single word. Nietzsche died in 1900. He is buried in a churchyard in Rocken, where his father had baptized him and where a strictly Lutheran tradition on both sides of the family had seemed to assure the formation of a Christian character. But it was Nietzsche's fate to regard himself as a quote-unquote atheist by instinct and to become Europe's most prominent nihilist. Humanity has yet been spared the quote-unquote universal madness which he predicted for the moment when mankind would discover that there is no God. The frightful doom of this vision was to be the tragic fate of the philosopher himself.